San Francisco's Museum of African Diaspora's executive director, Grace Stanislaus, kept with her vision of keeping alive the culture of Africans all over the world by bringing a traveling exhibit to the museum titled Soulful Stitching. These are extraordinary quilts stitched by Africans living in India. They have lived in India for centuries. The exhibit opening displayed masterpiece after masterpiece that awed those who attended. Attendees also enjoyed food and drink and jazz as they socialized. We'll conclude this broadcast with some of the quilts, sounds of jazz, and faces of the attendees who enjoy the event. Let's start with the co-curators of the exhibit. They'll give us a history lesson.
Hello, my name is Henry Druell. I'm Evu Bascom Professor of African and African Diaspora Arts at the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
And my name is Dr. Sarah Khan, and I'm an ethnobotanist with a background in public health and nutrition, and I'm the director and founder of the Taste and Cultures Organization and Foundation. And we're delighted to be with you today to talk about a show that Dr. Druell and I have had the pleasure to co-curate called
Soulful Stitching, Patchwork Quilts by Siddhis or Africans in India. That's at the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco until September 18th.
September 18th, yes. And we're here today to just give you some background as to how it came about, why we're passionate about it, and to share that with you, to share that excitement and passion. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Druell, who we will also call Henry, and he will call me Sarah, and we will let you know how this began. So Henry, why don't you take it away?
Well, Sarah was going to India to do her research for her PhD, and she said, if you want to spend some time with me, you might want to find a way to come to India. So I looked into it, started looking at the history of Africans in the diaspora, that is in South Asia specifically, applied for a grant and got one. This was back in 2001. But it was in 2004 when I was working with Siddhi communities, that is the name that's given to Africans who have lived in South Asia for 1,500 years. And when I was working with some communities in northern Karnataka, that I discovered a wonderful visual arts tradition of patchwork quilts. And it was when I was living with one of the Siddhi families in one of those villages. And
do you want to tell them the village, what part of India?
Mainale, it's northern Karnataka, right. And the village is Mainale. And I had had the honor of living with one of the families in that village. And the first morning I woke up after my first night sleeping in the house. I looked down and saw what I was sleeping on, and it was this fantastic patchwork quilt. So I started asking the women in the family and other women in the community. As I walked around the village, I started seeing these quilts out on the lines, drying and cleaning, and people using them for various purposes, and some of the women making patchwork quilts, and started asking about it, and that was the start of the Patchwork Quilt Project.
Yeah. It might be a good idea also now to step back just for a quick moment and give them a brief history about the Siddhis, and you've studied that extensively, had a chance to work with other scholars in India who are incredibly knowledgeable about the Indians of African descent. So can you take a few seconds and give us that history, because you're working in just one particular region.
Right, and looking at their present situation.
And after that, we'll also talk about at some point how the foundation that I work with is involved in it, and what we hope for the future. In addition to looking at these beautiful quilts, we want to expand it and look at their lives. But first, we still want to give you a snippet of the history, because this is a history that's not known to Indians, let alone to the larger world, and we're just very excited to share that with you. So can you tell us that, Hank?
Well, Africans have been in South Asia for more than 1,500 years. From the early centuries of this millennium, they've been traveling across the Indian Ocean as merchants, as sailors, as as people who were engaged in economic exchange. Those early Africans were coming probably from the Horn of Africa, that is Ethiopia and Somalia, and coming in large numbers and settling in the cities of the western coast of India. With the expansion of Islam, since about the 12th and 13th centuries, many of those Africans came as professional soldiers. They were in an Arab kind of slave trade economy, but as Amitav Ghosh helps us understand, that arrangement was not really like a master and slave relationship. It was more a patron-client relationship.
And Amitav Ghosh, the book that he's referring to is a wonderful book that he wrote called In an Antique Land. And if you'd like to read more about that, that's one starting point, but not the only starting point.
So the Africans who came into this system as professional soldiers could rise through the ranks of the military. Many of them rose to become generals and admirals of navies. They became prime ministers in the sultanates of South Asia, which is today Pakistan and India. There are African communities in Sri Lanka as well. And they rose through the ranks, and many of them became prominent leaders, especially in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. So that's a history of Africans in this part of the world that Americans are not aware of, and many South Asians are not aware of. Now, the Africans that we have lived with and worked with have a slightly different history. They come a little bit later, and they're brought to India, across the Indian Ocean, by the Portuguese from about the 16th century on. They're enslaved by the Portuguese, brought to Goa, where they serve primarily as domestic servants. But over the generations, those Africans escaped bondage and went into the interior and migrated further south into what is now northern Karnataka, and set up their own independent African communities, just like the Maroon communities in the Caribbean,
the Quilombos
of Brazil. This history of resistance against bondage is something that is shared by Africans wherever they have gone. And this is a very particular case.
And what's also interesting is, as they left Goa out of necessity and or to avoid enslavement, they went up into what is called today the Western Ghats, and the mountains, and developed communities there. And they were and still are predominantly people who work the land. And often what happens is they work the land, they improve the value of the land through their farming and techniques. And then that land in many instances often gets taken from them as they improve the value.
Right.
But
and their link to the land is one of the things that is related to your work in the Tasting Cultures Foundation. So why don't you tell us about that,
Well,
Sarah?
the Tasting Cultures Foundation, we develop multimedia education on food and culture. And we're particularly interested in studying further and learning from the Siddhis what their agricultural traditions have been, how they fare, what they grow, and not just what they grow on the land, but also what they grow in home gardens. When Henry has spent time there in the past, he's noted that many people have home gardens. So what are they growing? What do they grow to eat? What do they grow to treat themselves medicinally? What are those links?
What do they gather from
and what
the
do
forests?
they gather? One of the things that we found is that they are known to be gatherers of honey. And so it would be very, very interesting to further that and see, well, how do they gather it? How do they find the places? What are the techniques that they use? How do they process it, if at all? So these are some of the things that we want to delve into more through the foundation. But I would like to go back to the quilts now, and talk about the beauty of those quilts, how the women make them, what it means, how the cooperative works
was created.
So you can tell the world.
Well, soon after I saw these patchwork quilts in the city villages where I was staying, I asked the women, who did they make them for, and did they ever sell them? And they didn't. They were just making them for their daughters and their granddaughters as part of marriages and the birth of new children. They would make family quilts, and they would make also crib quilts or baby quilts that they would use to for their infants in the homes.
That are especially animated.
Yeah, exactly. So so we started to talk with the leaders of the Sindhi communities, the women leaders in those communities, and I worked to help them establish a quilting cooperative, which we call the Sindhi Women's Quilting Cooperative. We started in the village I was living in, Mainalei, which is primarily Catholic because they have their roots in Goa and their history with the Portuguese. But we also included 2 other villages, one Kendalgiri, which is primarily Muslim, so these are Muslim Siddhis, and then the 3rd village, Gunjavati, where it's a mixture of Catholic and Muslim and some Hindu Siddhis. So those are the 3 kind of major religious affiliations that the Siddhis have today. So they formed the quilting cooperative, and with some donations we paid women for the quilts that they had made, and we commissioned them and paid them for additional quilts, and those quilts were sent to us for sale here in the United States, and the income that we make from the sale of those quilts goes back to the cooperative, and there are about 38 women in that cooperative now, and
they independently decide and choose how they would like to use that money. It's often used for emergency health situations, for improving houses, for sending the young boys and young girls to school, to buy school equipment, and to buy agricultural equipment or seeds, and anything else that might occur. But they decide how they choose and spend that money.
So now, as co-curators, we have organized 32 of those quilts. We made a selection of those 32 quilts as a traveling exhibition. It's been held in about 3 or 4 places now. First at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and then recently
Texas.
In San Antonio, Texas, at St. Mary's School, and then recently the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York
Harlem,
City.
in New York.
And on July 15th, it opened at MoAD, at the Museum of the African Diaspora here in San Francisco.
And it's been wonderful, and you should go see it because the quilts vibrate. And it's an opportunity. There are many things we like about the show and the privilege of sharing it with other people is that we have photos of the quilters next to the quilts. They have, at first when you look at them, a lot of people think that, oh, they're all the same. But if you just spend a few minutes, you realize they're very, very different. And you can recognize the signature.